Synchronicity German, Synchronicität is a concept introduced by analytical psychologist Carl Jung, to describe circumstances that appear meaningfully related yet lack a causal connection. Synchronicity experiences refer to one's subjective experience whereby coincidences between events in one's mind and the outside world may be causally unrelated, yet have another unknown connection. Jung held this was a healthy function of the mind, that can become harmful within psychosis. Jung developed the theory as a hypothetical non-causal principle serving as the intersubjective or philosophically objective connection between these seemingly meaningful coincidences. After coining the term in the late 1920s, Jung developed the concept with physicist Wolfgang Pauli through correspondence and in their 1952 work The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. This culminated in the Pauli-Jung conjecture. Jung and Pauli's view was that, just as causal connections can provide a meaningful understanding of the psyche and the world, so too may causal connections. A 2016 study found 70% of therapists agreed synchronicity experiences could be useful for therapy. Analytical psychologists hold that individuals must understand the compensatory meaning of these experiences to enhance consciousness rather than merely build up superstitiousness. However, clients who disclose synchronicity experiences report not being listened to, accepted, or understood. The experience of overabundance of meaningful coincidences can be characteristic of schizophrenic delusion. Johansson and Osman write that, prevalent among many scientists, particularly psychologists studying coincidences, is the view that the occurrence of coincidences, as psychologically experienced, is induced by noisy chance occurrences out in the world which are then misconstrued via irrational cognitive biases into unfounded, possibly even paranormal, beliefs in the mind. A study has shown counselors and psychoanalysts were less likely than psychologists to agree chance coincidence was an adequate explanation for synchronicity, while more likely than psychologists to agree a need for unconscious material to be expressed could be an explanation for synchronicity experiences in the clinical setting. Jung used synchronicity in arguing for the existence of the paranormal. This idea was explored by Arthur Koestler in The Roots of Coincidence and taken up by the New Age movement. Unlike magical thinking, which believes causally unrelated events to have paranormal causal connection, synchronicity supposes events may be causally unrelated yet have unknown non-causal connection. The objection from a scientific standpoint is that this is neither testable nor falsifiable, so does not fall within empirical study. Scientific skepticism regards it as pseudoscience. Jung stated that synchronicity events are chance occurrences from a statistical point of view, but meaningful in that they may seem to validate paranormal ideas. No empirical studies of synchronicity based on observable mental states and scientific data were conducted by Jung to draw his conclusions. Those studies have since been done, see section studies. While someone may experience a coincidence as meaningful, this alone cannot prove objective meaning to the coincidence. Statistical laws or probability show how unexpected occurrences can be inevitable or more likely encountered than people assume. These explain coincidences such as synchronicity experiences as chance events which have been misinterpreted by confirmation biases, spurious correlations, or underestimated probability. Origins. Carl G. Jung, who coined the term synchronicity between 1928 and 1930. Synchronicity arose with Jung's use of the ancient Chinese oracle I Ching. It has 64 hexagrams, each built from 2 trigrams or bagua. A divination is made by seemingly random numerical happenings for which the I Ching text gives detailed situational analysis. Richard Wilhelm, translator of Chinese, provided Jung with validation. Jung met Wilhelm in Darmstadt, Germany, where Hermann von Kaiserling hosted Gesellschaft für freie Philosophie. In 1923 Wilhelm was in Zurich, as was Jung, attending the Psychology Club, where Wilhelm promulgated the I Ching. Finally, I Ching was published with Wilhelm's commentary. I instantly obtained the book and found to my gratification that Wilhelm took much the same view of the meaningful connections as I had. But he knew the entire literature and could therefore fill in the gaps which had been outside my competence. Anila Jaffe, 1962, Memories, Dreams, Reflections of C. G. Jung. Jung coined the term synchronicity as part of a lecture in May 1930, or as early as 1928, at first for use in discussing Chinese religious and philosophical concepts. His first public articulation of the term came in 1930 at the memorial address for Richard Wilhelm, where Jung stated, "The science of the I Ching is based not on the causality principle but on one which, hitherto unnamed because not familiar to us, I have tentatively called the synchronistic principle. The I Ching is one of the 5 classics of Confucianism. By selecting a passage according to the traditional chance operations such as tossing coins and counting out yarrow stalks, the text is supposed to give insights into a person's inner states." Jung characterized this as the belief in synchronicity, and himself believed the text to give apt readings in his own experiences. He would later also recommend this practice to certain of his patients. Jung argued that synchronicity could be found diffused throughout Chinese philosophy more broadly and in various Taoist concepts. Jung also drew heavily from German philosophers Gottfried Leibniz, whose own exposure to I Ching divination in the 17th century was the primary precursor to the theory of synchronicity in the West, Arthur Schopenhauer, whom Jung placed alongside Leibniz as the 2 philosophers most influential to his formulation of the concept, and Johannes Kepler. He points to Schopenhauer, especially, as providing an early conception of synchronicity in the quote, "All the events in a man's life would accordingly stand in 2 fundamentally different kinds of connection. Firstly, in the objective, causal connection of the natural process. Secondly, in a subjective connection which exists only in relation to the individual who experiences it, and which is thus as subjective as his own dreams." As with Paul Kammerer's theory of seriality developed in the late 1910s, Jung looked to hidden structures of nature for an explanation of coincidences. In 1932, physicist Wolfgang Pauli and Jung began what would become a long-spanning correspondence in which they discussed and collaborated on various topics surrounding synchronicity, contemporary science, and what is now known as the Pauli effect. Jung also built heavily upon the idea of numinosity, a concept originating in the work of German religious scholar Rudolf Otto, which describes the feeling of gravitas found in religious experiences, and which perhaps brought greatest criticism upon Jung's theory. Jung also drew from parapsychologist J.B. Rhine, whose work in the 1930s had at the time appeared to validate certain claims about extrasensory perception. It was not until a 1951 Arenos conference lecture, after having gradually developed the concept for over 2 decades, that Jung gave his first major outline of synchronicity. The following year, Jung and Pauli published their 1952 work The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, German, Naturerklärung und Psyche, which contained Jung's central monograph on the subject, synchronicity, and a causal connecting principle. Other notable influences and precursors to synchronicity can be found in the theological concept of correspondences, sympathetic magic, astrology, and alchemy. Pauli-Jung conjecture. Further information. Section Philosophy of Science. Wolfgang Pauli. The Pauli-Jung conjecture is a collaboration in metatheory between physicist Wolfgang Pauli and analytical psychologist Carl Jung, centered on the concept of synchronicity. It was mainly developed between the years 1946 and 1954, 4 years before Pauli's death, and speculates on a double-aspect perspective within the disciplines of both collaborators. Pauli additionally drew on various elements of quantum theory such as complementarity, non-locality, and the observer effect in his contributions to the project. Jung and Pauli thereby offered the radical and brilliant idea that the currency of these correlations is not quantitative statistics, as in quantum physics, but qualitative meaning. Contemporary physicist T. Filk writes that quantum entanglement, being a particular type of a causal quantum correlations, was plausibly taken by Pauli as a model for the relationship between mind and matter in the framework he proposed together with Jung. Specifically, quantum entanglement may be the physical phenomenon which most closely represents the concept of synchronicity. Analytical Psychology, edit. In analytical psychology, the recognition of seemingly meaningful coincidences is a mechanism by which unconscious material is brought to the attention of the conscious mind. A harmful or developmental outcome can then result only from the individual's response to such material. Jung proposed that the concept could have psychiatric use in mitigating the negative effects of over-rationalization and proclivities towards mind-body dualism. Analytical psychology considers modern modes of thought to rest upon the pre-modern and primordial structures of the psyche. Causal connections thus form the basis of modern worldviews, and connections which lack causal reasoning are seen as chance. This chance-based interpretation, however, is incongruent with the primordial mind, which instead interprets this category as intention. The primordial framework in fact places emphasis on these connections, just as the modern framework emphasizes causal ones. In this regard, causality, like synchronicity, is a human interpretation imposed onto external phenomena. Primordial modes of thought are, however, according to Jung, necessary constituents of the modern psyche that inevitably protrude into modern life, providing the basis for meaningful interpretation of the world by way of meaning-based connections. Just as the principles of psychological causality provide meaningful understanding of causal connections, so too the principle of synchronicity attempts to provide meaningful understanding of causal connections. Jung placed synchronicity as one of three main conceptual elements in understanding the psyche. Psychological causality, as understood in Freudian theory, by which repressed libidinal energy is discharged across the psyche in response to principles of cause and effect, though Jung broadened this to a more generalized mental energy that is particular to the unfolding of the individual psyche. Psychological teleology, by which self-actualization is an element of the psyche as potential. Psychological synchronicity, or meaningful chance, by which the potential for self-actualization is either enhanced or negated. Jung felt synchronicity to be a principle that had explanatory power towards his concepts of archetypes in the collective unconscious. It described a governing dynamic which underlies the whole of human experience and history, social, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. The emergence of the synchronistic paradigm was a significant move away from Cartesian dualism towards an underlying philosophy of double-aspect theory. Some argue this shift was essential in bringing theoretical coherence to Jung's earlier work. Philosophy of Science, edit. Jung held that there was both a philosophical and scientific basis for synchronicity. He identified the complementary nature of causality and acausality with Eastern sciences and proto-scientific disciplines, stating, "The East bases much of its science on this irregularity and considers coincidences as the reliable basis of the world rather than causality. Synchronism is the prejudice of the East, causality is the modern prejudice of the West." See also, Universal Causation. Contemporary scholar L. K. Kerr writes, Jung also looked to modern physics to understand the nature of synchronicity, and attempted to adapt many ideas in this field to accommodate his conception of synchronicity, including the property of numinosity. He worked closely with Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli and also consulted with Albert Einstein. The notion of synchronicity shares with modern physics the idea that under certain conditions, the laws governing the interactions of space and time can no longer be understood according to the principle of causality. In this regard, Jung joined modern physicists in reducing the conditions in which the laws of classical mechanics apply. It is also pointed out that, since Jung took into consideration only the narrow definition of causality, only the efficient cause, his notion of acausality is also narrow and so is not applicable to final and formal causes as understood in Aristotelian or Thomist systems. Either the final causality is inherent in synchronicity, as it leads to individuation, or synchronicity can be a kind of replacement for final causality. However, such finalism or teleology is considered to be outside the domain of modern science. Citation needed. Jung's theory, and philosophical worldview implicated by it, includes not only mainstream science thoughts but also esoteric ones and ones that are against mainstream. Paranormal. Astral configurations in astrology represent for Jung an example of synchronicity, that is, of a parallel, non-causal relationship between the development of celestial phenomena and those marked by terrestrial time. Jung's use of the concept in arguing for the existence of paranormal phenomena has been widely considered pseudoscientific by modern scientific skepticism. Furthermore, his collaborator Wolfgang Pauli objected to his dubious experiments of the concept involving astrology, which Jung believed to be supported by the laboratory experiments behind the uncertainty principle's formulation. Jung similarly turned to the works of parapsychologist Joseph B. Rhine to support a connection between synchronicity and the paranormal. In his book Synchronicity, a causal connecting principle, Jung wrote, "How are we to recognize a causal combinations of events, since it is obviously impossible to examine all chance happenings for their causality? The answer to this is that a causal events may be expected most readily where, on closer reflection, a causal connection appears to be inconceivable. It is impossible, with our present resources, to explain extrasensory perception, or the fact of meaningful coincidence, as a phenomenon of energy. This makes an end of the causal explanation as well, for effect cannot be understood as anything except a phenomenon of energy. Therefore it cannot be a question of cause and effect, but of a falling together in time, a kind of simultaneity. Because of this quality of simultaneity, I have picked on the term synchronicity to designate a hypothetical factor equal in rank to causality as a principle of explanation." Roderick Mayne, in the introduction to his 1997 book Jung on Synchronicity and the Paranormal. The culmination of Jung's lifelong engagement with the paranormal is his theory of synchronicity, the view that the structure of reality includes a principle of a causal connection which manifests itself most conspicuously in the form of meaningful coincidences. Difficult, flawed, prone to misrepresentation, this theory nonetheless remains one of the most suggestive attempts yet made to bring the paranormal within the bounds of intelligibility. It has been found relevant by psychotherapists, parapsychologists, researchers of spiritual experience and a growing number of non-specialists. Indeed, Jung's writings in this area form an excellent general introduction to the whole field of the paranormal. Studies. A 1989 overview of research areas and methodology in the study of coincidence published by the Journal of the American Statistical Association addresses various potentials in researching synchronicity experiences. A 2009 paper found that, clinically, synchronicity experiences seem to cluster around periods of emotional intensity or major life transitions, such as births, deaths, and marriage. A 2016 study found that clients who have disclosed synchronicity experiences in clinical setting often report not being listened to, accepted, or understood. The study also found that for therapists these experiences often come as a shock and a challenge their own worldviews, prompting researchers to specify a need to provide accurate and reliable information about synchronicity experiences for mental health professionals. Another 2016 study of 226 therapists found that 44% reported synchronicity experiences in the therapeutic setting, and 67% felt that synchronicity experiences could be useful for therapy. The study also points out ways of explanations of synchronicity. For example, psychologists were significantly more likely than both counselors and psychotherapists to agree that chance coincidence was an explanation for synchronicity, whereas counselors and psychotherapists were significantly more likely than psychologists to agree that a need for unconscious material to be expressed could be an explanation for synchronicity experiences in the clinical setting. A 2018 study shows that the concept of synchronicity finds clinical application in psychotherapies in form of a Jungian-specific approach to interpretation. Already the conceptual idea of synchronicity offers the therapist an additional therapeutic tool to put potentially meaningful experienced coincidences between him and the patient into a subjective narrative, which can be experienced by the patient as meaningful. If a synchronistic moment is sensitively recognized, thematized and interpreted as such, it can have positive consequences for the therapeutic relationship and therapy. A 2019 study proposed to test whether synchronicity manifests as an objective feature of the physical world. The results of whether Fibonacci algorithms would predict increased synchronicity experiences compared to chance showed a significant difference between observed synchronicity matches and expected frequencies based on chance for the HM harmonic model algorithm, and no significant difference in matches predicted by the GSM golden section model algorithm. Thank you for watching our video.